We continue with Rabbi Stephen Przansky's book, A Prophet for Today, which is about Yehoshua. And we are now at one of the pinnacle moments in the book, one of the pinnacle moments in our history, the conquest of Jericho, of Jericho. To really appreciate how important this moment is, you have to understand what Jericho was. Right? We think of it as, a city that was knocked down. Right? But I think we're all familiar with, it's probably one of the most powerful of the spirituals that the slaves used to sing in the South, because it gave them hope. Right? That was the nature of all the spirituals connected to the Old Testament, to our Chumash, was the sense of you could go free in the blink of an eye. That something could change. God could will it to happen. And so the story of Jericho is really in a class with the story of the Exodus of Egypt for many, many generations of people who were enslaved. It was a dream that a band of people could come out of the desert and conquer a city that was virtually inconquerable. Now, so that you understand a little bit more about this, this was not just a battle for the city. It was clear from the beginning that this was a battle for the land of Israel. That the troops massed in Jericho to fight against the Jews were not the people of Jericho. They were 19 Canaanite kings that brought their troops into Jericho to defend Jericho. Jericho is described as the latch, the lock on the door.
Exactly.
Right. Nagra is the word. That it was the lock on the door to the land. Right. And so this conquest opened up the rest of the conquests. Right. So it was of tremendous importance, and we're going to look into this in detail. And we'll understand that Jericho, its destruction, was intended to be forever. There was a curse put on anybody who would ever rebuild Jericho. And the curse was fulfilled, I should add. We'll come to it. But Jericho was supposed to stand as a monument, because our image of Jericho is that something happened and the walls fell down. They didn't fall down. They actually sunk into the earth, directly into the earth, as though the earth gave way in a circle around the city, and they just sank into the earth, not scattered all over the place. Right? And this was intended to be a monument that people would always be able to see. Right? We'll come to it. We'll come to it.
I wanted to ask
the same question. Monument was sunk. What is a monument? Where is a monument? If it's sunk?
No, that you could see the top of the walls.
You can see?
Yeah, these were huge walls, and you could see, and apparently you can still see.
Really?
Right. The upper layer.
No.
Right. Jericho didn't go. Jericho has three main distinctions. It is the lowest city on earth, 900 feet below sea level.
Is Jericho not far from the Dead Sea? On that side?
Yes. Yeah. It is the oldest city on earth, with a recorded history of more than 4,000 years, and the first Jewish conquest in the land of Israel. Paradoxically, and not at all unrelated, it was the first city lost by the modern state of Israel to the Palestinian Authority when it was surrendered in 1994.
Oslo Agreement.
The story of its conquest is one of the most famous in the Bible. As conventional military strategy with an army and weapons were spurned, Jericho was vanquished through spiritual weapons alone. You could say that this was the first experience of weapons of mass destruction, non-conventional warfare. We'll see. The Kohanim, the priests, circled the walls of the city while sounding the shofar once a day for 6 days. and then 7 times on the 7th day, and the walls came tumbling down, as the song says. The story, however, is profound, and its message to Jews resonates until today. Jericho was a unique city that was frequently referred to by our sages in esoteric ways. For example, notwithstanding that Jericho is located on the northern shore of the Dead Sea, 20 miles east of Yerushalayim, the Gemara Tamid in 30b states, this is an amazing Gemara. States that in Jericho they were able to hear the sound of the opening of the large gate of the Temple Mount. The sound of the megrefa. The megrefa, it was a kind of shovel, or maybe a musical instrument. There's a discussion about it. The song of the Levim. Ben Arzar Alevi playing the cymbals, the flute, the voice of Gabini, the herald summoning the Kohanim and the Levim to the temple service, and some say even the Kohen Gadol's pronunciation of God's name on Yom Kippur.
How many kilometers it was from Jerusalem? 20 miles from Jerusalem?
That's what it is,
Yeah, it's not enough.
20 miles from
You
Jerusalem.
can't hear 20 miles, it's almost 40 kilometers.
40 kilometers. It's,
So the Dead Sea is not far from Jerusalem.
Maybe figuratively
But
speaking.
sound, yeah, is
No,
it figuratively or literally?
I can't hear people speaking on Bathurst Street. I can't hear people playing music on the street
But it was divine
on Milner
intervention.
Gate.
Yeah, it's
So
probably
let's see what the Gemara says.
divine.
The Tana relates that the sound of the great gate being opened was heard in Jericho, and thus parenthetically enumerates other sounds from the temple heard in Jericho. From Jericho they would hear the sound of the great gate being opened. From Jericho they would hear the sound of the shovel. Okay, I'll read the notes I'll come back and read the notes in a second. Okay, let me read the text first. They would hear the sound of the shovel. From Jericho, they would hear the sound of Ben Azara banging the cymbals. From Jericho, they would hear the sound of the flute. From Jericho, they would hear the sound of Gavini, the crier who would summon the Kohanim to the services. From Jericho, they would hear the sound of the wood that Ben Katin fashioned for the wheel of the kior. There was a wheel that was geared that would raise and lower the kior into the well to fill the kior up each day. And in Jericho, they could hear the sound of these gears of the wheel that would turn. From Jericho, they would hear the sound of the song of the Levim. From Jericho, one would hear the voice of the shofar. And some also said the sound of the Kohen Gadol when he mentioned God's name on Yom Kippur. From Jericho, they could smell the fragrance of the compounded incense that was burned in the Holy of Holies. So what does it mean? Let's look at the notes.
There is it says the voice of Gavini is probably the Gabbai, right? Who was calling. The word Gabbai. Gavini, you said the
It could
Gavini?
come from that.
Yeah,
it
probably
could
Gabbai,
come from that.
who
Yeah.
was calling for the service.
Yeah, he was apparently Yisrael, who would wake up the Kohanim and the Levim to do their job.
The Gabbai is-
He had to make sure that the sun had risen over Hebron before he could do this. Jericho is located 10 parses from Jerusalem. 1 parsa is a Persian mile, equals 4 mil. A mil is 2,000 amos. 10 parsa, then 40 mil is 80,000 amos. Anyway, we know it's about 20 miles. The Rishonim infer from other sources that this does not mean the sound was so loud that it was heard within the 10 parsha radius of Jerusalem. Right? So what they're saying here is that it's not that it could be heard from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was heard in Jerusalem and it was heard in Jericho, but not in between. Right? As though you had a loudspeaker system connected in Jericho. Rather, it was heard only in Jericho. Several reasons are given for this. The Rosh records a view that the sound traveled through the escape tunnel that Tzidkatyahu had dug from Jerusalem to Jericho. Ravad writes that no mountains or other obstacles stood between Jerusalem and Jericho to block the sound, which is not true of other directions. He also cites his teacher's opinion that this was a miraculous phenomenon inspired by a special spiritual status of Jericho. As the first conquest of Eretz Yisrael, Jericho is considered Truma, the portion of the land. And then it gives references here. It is therefore joins Jerusalem in a commonality of holiness. It has a special, unique holiness because it was the entrance way. The Tana continually repeat the expression from Jericho to intimate that various sounds he enumerates were not heard equally. Some were not heard on every occasion, some were not heard by every person. This is then notes about the different kinds of sounds. There were 2 copper instruments that were struck together to produce a musical sound. Ben-Azar was in charge of all the musical instruments in the temple. When he sounded the cymbals, the Levim began to sing.
Are you going to explain why we cannot live in Jericho?
Why could not? What?
Why we cannot live in Jericho?
Why we cannot? Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Jericho shouldn't exist, actually.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gavini was actually a Kohen. A Kohen named Gavini would call out early in the morning before dawn. Arise, Kohanim, to your service, Levim to your platform, Yisrael to your stations. Gavini was the name of the original crier. All subsequent criers were called by his name.
It's a personal name.
So then it itemizes each thing because each thing is done at different times in different places. Okay, so that's what the Gemara says about the relationship to Jericho and Jerusalem. It's clearly somehow very special. All this, back to Rabbi Brzezinski, was heard in Jericho. How is it possible? Apparently the city of Jericho is intrinsically linked to the divine service in the base of Mikdash and to Yerushalayim itself. What is the connection? An additional midrash notes that on Sukkot, in the temple, people carry the lulavim and the etrogim and circle the altar once a day for 6 days and 7 times on Hoshana Rabbah, which we do today. Rabbi Chia stated that it was in remembrance of the events at Jericho.
Really?
Wow.
And this practice is maintained today, notwithstanding there is no temple or altar. But what is the connection between the Hakafas, the circuits, and the Hoshana Rabbah and the Battle of Jericho? It's an amazing thing. I never knew this before. Furthermore, the Gemara in Bracha comments that one who sees the walls of Jericho, which were swallowed up by the ground, must recite the blessing of thanksgiving. What is so special about Jericho in this battle? Elsewhere in the Midrash affirms that when the Jews came to wage war against Jericho, let me just get this Midrash here for you.
Why?
What?
Why?
Why get it?
Why skip it?
No, I'm getting it.
Oh.
I'm getting in the text itself. Not skipping it, quite the opposite.
Not skipping.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, I saw the commentary. The show was also Jericho. No sign.
Okay. When Joshua came to fight against Jericho, the 7 nations assembled in Jericho, as may be inferred from the text. And ye went over the Jordan, and came to Jericho, and the men of Jericho fought against you, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite, and I delivered them into your hand. Now were the men of Jericho 7 nations, Reb Shmuel Nachami explained. Jericho was the bulwark of the land of Israel. If Jericho was taken, the whole country would instantly be conquered. Consequently, the 7 nations assembled therein. What is written in connection with the people shouted and the priests blew with horns, this teaches us that even Joshua, his own disciple, meaning the disciple of Moshe, did not use them. Nor must you suppose that this applies only to Joshua. It applies even to Moshe, our teacher. For while he was himself still alive, the trumpets were divinely stored away. So they didn't use trumpets, they used shofars. that even in Moshe's life they put the trumpets aside. Now the trumpets were
After
actually
they were
used for war.
Trumpet.
Right? They were intended to be used for war. Rabbi Yitzchak proves it as follows. You observe that Moshe, when he was about to depart from this world, assemble unto me all the elders of your tribes and your officers. But where were the trumpets which blow and assemble them? We must say that while he was still living, they were divinely stored away. This was Reb Joshua of Siknin, in the name of Reb Levi, confirms the text. Neither hath he the power in the day of his death. Thus we have explained that make thee 2 trumpets of silver, you must make it for you, and no one else use them all your life. So the trumpets were put away, right?
Just 2.
Right, the 2 silver trumpets, yeah. But really the point of this medrash, which I wanted to make earlier, was that it wasn't viewed as a battle between the king of Jericho and the Jews. It was virtually all the Canaanite nations were massed at Jericho to push back the Jews. Right? Let me just find a place.
It was 19 kings.
I said 19, I was wrong. 7, it looks like.
7.
Maybe, I don't know where I got 19 from. I think it may come up later. Let me see. Elsewhere in the Midrash affirms that when the Jews came to wage war against Jericho, all 7 Canaanite nations gathered in Jericho to resist the attack. Did then all 7 nations possess Jericho? Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachami says, Jericho is the bolt, the latch. They call it the Nagra, the latch of the door to the vault of the land of Israel. If Jericho would be conquered, the land entirely would in short order fall to Israel as well. Therefore, all 7 nations gathered in Jericho to fight. Why was this battle the definitive battle for the land of Israel? So you have to understand, again, we're going to come back to this, what Jericho was to the ancient world. In the ancient world, the city of Jericho enjoyed a reputation for impregnability. It was unconquerable. And Jericho was completely sealed before the children of Israel. Nobody left, nobody came. It's from Yehoshua. It was walled, locked, and fortified. Even its own people on the eve of war were prohibited from entering and exiting. Moreover, the walls of the city protected it from invasion and protected the land as well. Jericho lies on the plains of the Jordan Valley and controls the entrance to the land of Israel. If the city of Jericho is breached and conquered, the invader then can easily ascend the mountains of the Jordan Desert and have complete access to the land. So Jericho was literally the portal to the land of Israel, and therefore its vital strategic location demanded the strictest security measures. So how could the city be conquered? You should have this in mind today. Jericho is in the hands of those that want to destroy Israel. Right? Today. Now, we have a tendency to think that in modern warfare, these issues of conquering the heights and having the plains to yourself are not important because of air power, because of guided missiles and things like that. But to be clear, we seem to think the Golan Heights are very valuable.
Yeah.
And for a good reason. And the fact that Jericho is not in friendly hands is something to be concerned about. God said to Yeshua, Behold, I have delivered into your hands Jericho and its kings and mighty warriors. You shall circumnavigate the city, all the soldiers encircling the city one time. This should be done for 6 days. And 7 Kohanim shall carry 7 shofarot before the ark. And on the 7th day you shall encircle the city 7 times, and the Kohanim shall blow the shofarot. And it shall be that with an extended blast of the shofar, when you hear the sound of the shofar, all the people will cry with a great cry, and the wall of the city will fall down in its place. And the people shall advance, each man straight ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. This was the order of battle. This is all they had to do to win this war. Right? The soldiers surrounded the city, followed by the Kohanim and the Shofarot and other Kohanim carrying the Ark of the Covenant, followed by the rear guard of soldiers and the rest of the people. But why were the soldiers needed at all? They were not fighting, as this was not a conventional war, but a war of miracles and divine providence. The participation of the Kohanim should have sufficed. So why were the soldiers enlisted? And to do little but pass before the Aron itself. That's a quote. They were to pass before the Aron and encircle the city and nothing else. They didn't actually have to carry weapons. It was like a protest march, you know?
Yeah.
And so it was. For 6 days, the armies of Israel, the troops passed before and behind the ark, surrounded the city, and 7 Kohanim blew a shofar. On the 7th day, this is a quote, they arose early at dawn and walked around the city 7 times. On the 7th time, the Kohanim blew the shofar, and Yehoshua said to the people, "Cry out, for God has given you the city. Everything in the city is consecrated property to God." This is important. "Everyone is to be killed except for Rachav and her family." The people cried out, the Kohanim blew the shofarot, the wall fell in its place, and the people went up, and the city was conquered. End of story. Pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, divine information.
Yet wall fall down, but people stay alive.
You can
Yeah,
imagine the shock, right?
Yeah.
You understand the first thing you do is you lay siege to the city. Then you start to attack the city with war machines and throw boiling oil over the top, and they throw it back, and it's a whole process, right? You know, the people understood, okay, there's a siege going on for the 6 days. That's normal, right? They found it strange that the soldiers were marching around, that they weren't really armed, and that they were playing music, you know, it was protest songs. But they were completely unprepared. It's as though a curtain just sank, and you're looking at your enemy, right? Where you thought the wall was going to protect you all this time. And this is a very important idea about walls, right? You know, there's a very...
You say you have to kill people.
The property.
Yeah. But the property is sanctified to God. Nobody touches the property.
You just leave it and you continue to go.
It's not for you. It's not for you.
What do you mean sanctified to God? It's taken for a
It's
temple?
not booty for the individuals. Well, it's unclear
Not
so
gold,
far.
not silver, not properties, nothing. Okay, now the question, who would kill the people in the city?
The army.
Soldiers.
What?
Soldiers.
Yeah.
So that's why you need soldiers.
Well, in a sense, do you really, right? Because if you could do this with the walls, you could have caused the people to die from a plague, right? But let's see what it says, right? It seems that there's a partnership involved. You're right. Rachav was saved, the city was utterly destroyed, burnt down, and the material wealth was duly consecrated to God, and the city itself was cursed. Yehoshua adjured the nation, saying, "Cursed before God is the one who arises and rebuilds this city, Jericho. And with its oldest child he will lay its foundation, and with its youngest he will position its gates," meaning the builder's children will not survive the construction of the new city.
It's just for the Jews?
Doesn't say. Doesn't say, but we're talking about Jews because, after all...
So this curse is for the Jews. It's not for Gentiles.
We're going to come to it.
Arabs live it
Right.
today.
That when you say it's like a weapon, first weapons mass destruction. So why is it called like a weapon of mass destruction?
Because it's not because all that was required was to blow trumpets, and the city collapsed and was destroyed.
I thought that I'm thinking.
Yeah.
correctly,
Yeah, it wasn't a normal way to fight a war.
Okay.
Very efficient
No, I understood. I just wanted to confirm.
weapon.
Yeah. A few more questions arise. Why the shofars? Usually instruments of prayer. Here they're employed as weapons of war. Secondly, the Yerushalmi teaches that a siege of a city cannot be started within 3 days of the onset of Shabbos. Remember this. You're not the Yerushalmi tells us that you can't start a siege within 3 days of Shabbos.
On Wednesday you don't siege the city.
You don't start a siege, right? You start a siege on Sunday.
After
Why?
Shabbos.
Because God willing,
Or for what people in the city?
when you're fighting a war, you have control of the siege,
Right.
right? You lay siege to a city. You don't do it on Thursday.
But it's going to
Right.
be many more Shabboses
Maybe not. Maybe not.
Maybe not. Depends.
You
how
want to
fast
give it as
they
much
do
time as possible for them to surrender.
It depends on how fast. they
But
do
let's.
it.
But we learn a lesson from
Yeah.
it. We learn a
Right.
lesson from it. Right? This is a question. Secondly, the Shalom teaches that a siege of a city cannot be started within 3 days of the onset of Shabbos, so as not to necessitate undue Shabbos desecration. But this applies only to an optional war. An obligatory war can be waged even on Shabbos. As we find, and the Yerushalmi goes on to say, as we find the conquest of Jericho occurred on Shabbos itself. Right? That seventh day, remember, 6 days they walked around.
Right, and then the
The seventh day, they blew, and it came down. What do we call the seventh day? The seventh day is always Shabbos. When we say the seventh day,
You mean they
it's Shabbos.
started it on Shabbos and finished it on Shabbos?
No, they started it on Sunday,
Sunday.
right?
Seventh day.
No, that would be the eighth day. If you have a
Yeah,
birth on
okay. It would be
Shabbos,
from Shabbos to
you have a bris
Shabbos,
on
the
Shabbos,
eighth
right?
day.
So they started it on Sunday,
Finished
right?
on Shabbos.
And they were following God's instructions, right? But it's an unusual thing to do. So we find the conquest of Jericho occurred on Shabbos, as it says. Do this for 6 days, and on the seventh day, circle the city 7 times. The seventh day was Shabbos, the day on which the walls of Jericho would fall. But why did the conquest have to occur on Shabbos? Why not wait until Sunday? Finally, why did Yehoshua order the city of Jericho never to be rebuilt? In fact, we see that Jericho was repopulated over the ages, including a significant community in Talmudic times. Good. Why was there even a demand that Jericho never be rebuilt? Indeed, the Gemara in Sanhedrin rules that the name Jericho cannot be applied to another city, nor can another city be built and use the name Jericho. Why is that? So, we're asking a lot of questions here, and in case you would say, okay, so big deal, they wanted to not rebuild the city. But in fact, it would be very natural to want to rebuild this city. Why? Because it's a great strategic importance. If it was the latch that you conquered to enter the land, how much more important it is that you make that latch more powerful when the enemy comes to enter your land. Right?
Maybe the reason why they don't want to rebuild the city because they want to show that God on guard always keeps.
Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. So Joshua made this command: never rebuild the city. Right? So they did.
But they did. They rebuilt.
In Kings, Malachim, no, this is the wrong one. Hang on a second. Yeah, here it is. Okay.
Will Israel ever attack?
So they're listing all the wonderful kings of Israel here, right? And they come to one that we're very familiar with, right? Ahab, right? Made an Asherah tree, and Ahab did more to anger Hashem. Remember Ahab and Jezebel?
I didn't hear the word. Share what?
Asherah tree. A Asherah tree was a tree that was... Yeah. We're talking about a famous couple, right? Ahab and Jezebel, right? Ahab made an Asherah tree, and Ahab did more to anger God, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel who had preceded him. That's the end of Ahab for this portion, right? Now they go on to the next king, right? In the days of Ahab, Hiel, the Bethelite, he was from Bethel, right? Built up Jericho. With the death of Abriam, his firstborn, he laid the foundations. And with the death of Segub, his youngest, he installed its doors. Like the word of Hashem, he had spoken through the hand of Joshua, the son of Nun. So it's clear that, and this was the thing that really seems to have set Eliyahu off. At Ahab. Yeah, it goes into Eliyahu's fight with Ahab after that, right? But so it was rebuilt, right, during the time of the evil king, right? and it came to no end. We have an understanding that once this curse was violated and came about, that it lost its power, per se. So we don't have a view now that a person is forbidden to build Jericho. I certainly wouldn't want to be the person to do it. But there's a view that the curse has exhausted itself, so to speak. Right? Nonetheless, it's not a good place for Jews to live. That's pretty clear.
So that's why we give it to Palestinian Authority?
Well, that's a different discussion. Why we gave it to Palestinian Authority seems to have been a current political issue, and I think that it raises a lot of very important questions, really, for Israel's security. So the Sanhedrin says not only can you not build Jericho, you can't even name another city in another place. If you go into exile in Babylon, you can't create a city called Jericho.
Like Jericho.
If you decide, I'm going to name the peninsula of Spain and Portugal after the Hebrews, the Iberian Peninsula. People call it the Iberian Peninsula now, but Iberian, right? They could not have called the city in Spain Jericho. Couldn't have done it.
In the States, they have a lot, but they have everything in the States.
They have many cities called Jericho. Absolutely, yeah.
In the States.
In the States,
in the States, in Canada, in many places.
People have Sodom. Somebody, people, when you drive.
Nice city to live.
Yeah. There is in Toronto, there's a city. There's a street. There's a street called Sodom.
Where? In Toronto?
Yeah. I always wonder who are the people who live on the street.
Wow.
The Sodomites. I don't know.
Not the Jews.
But there is a street in Toronto.
I know.
Like
S-O-D-O-M.
Biblical, it doesn't matter what it's.
Yeah.
Probably in the old part of the city.
Yeah. Okay. So, Rabbi Dessler explains that the essence of bitachon, faith in God, is the recognition that everything comes from God. Emunah, loosely translated as belief, is the corpus of philosophical ideas about God and the existence that each person possesses, whereas bitachon is the effect that those ideas have on a person's soul and personality. So this is always a difficult discussion between emunah and bitachon. So Rav Dressler is explaining that one is philosophical and one affects actions directly. So a philosophy, once it becomes internalized, actually affects your behavior, right? But until it becomes internalized, it's intellectualized, it's something that we observe in the world and say, oh, God must be running the world. Once we have a sense that God is really running the world, then our emunah becomes much more powerful.
But those two words always go together, emunah bitachon, because one supports the other.
Not always, actually.
No?
Not really, because you can have a philosophical outlook without it being affecting your behavior. In fact, many people do.
My personal experience, God forbid something happen, it's very hard to. I think bitachon, it's actualized emunah, like manifested. How you behave in a situation when money is not coming, and you know that Hashem will. But what about now?
Bitachon по-русски это вообще оборона. Иммуна это вера. No, what I'm explaining to me.
Let's just go and see what Rav Dressler says, okay?
It's different meanings of two words. And one is supporting the other. The
framework of bitachon is the realization that everything that occurs in life comes from God. And man surrendered to the overpowering reality defines his relationship with God. Even though we are obligated to make our own hishtadlus, our own efforts, the ultimate success or failure is not dependent on our exertions, but on God's will. Okay? So God is saying you shouldn't depend on miracles. This is a very important concept within Yiddishkeit. You shouldn't depend on miracles. That is to say, I've decided this year I'm not going to work, and I'll wait for the lottery ticket to come in. Right? This is not a good idea. Right? You should work. Right? But at the end of the day, when you get your paycheck, you shouldn't have the simple attitude that this is all mine, I made it myself. You should understand that the fact that you had the job and how it processed and how it worked out, God had a very big hand in it, a partnership in it. Right? That is to say, you make the effort, but the determination, right, is God's at the end. So the best example for this that I can think of is to say, well, if a person is a really good person, right, he should be able to walk across the 407 at 5 in the morning, right, and not be hit by a car wearing a black outfit, right? Because God is going to protect him, right? I'm a good Jew. I keep kosher. I do all my mitzvahs, right? So I can do that, right? So maybe God has a policy that says you're very special, right? And I'm going to give you a 90% guarantee of life. The other guy over there, I'm going to give 65%, 70%, right? You, I'm going to give 95%. But the 5% is that you should be so stupid as to test me and walk across the busiest highway in the country, in the middle of the night wearing black, that you can still lose your life in that situation, right? So we need to understand that God's calculations for us are not cut and dried and involve our own effort, but they are not separated from God's will in terms of the results of our effort. We often think that our actions are the true causes of whatever effects we produce. But in fact, the ultimate results are reflections of God's will. The only person who need not make any effort is one who dedicates his entire essence to God and Torah. And this person need not worry about material matters at all. Most people are not on this exalted level, and they are tested by having work. We know the story of Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, Rav Eliezer, who were shocked when they came out of the cave and they saw people farming. What are they farming for? God will provide, right? And God, and their view was very destructive. Things were burning when they looked at them. And God said, back in the cave, you're not ready to come out yet, right? And gave them another year in the cave, right? And when they came out, his son was still very much zealous and didn't think that people should be working. They should devote all their time to God and not work, right? And whatever he looked at would go up in flames, right? And the cure for it is that whatever his father, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, would look at, it would put out the flames and everything would be okay, right? So there's an idea that there are individuals in this world who have so perfected their relationship with God that they become, in a way, a kind of a pure servant. That's their job in life, is to be the servant of God.
PC Cleaner Definitions database have been automatically updated.
That's a word from our advertiser, I guess. I don't know. Sorry about that. But the rest of us, right? God says, you put in your hours, and I take care of the reward. But don't think you don't need to put in your hours. Right? So,
but I don't put 16 hours, I put 8 hours, because I do have a bit of fun.
And this person need not worry about material matters at all. And such a person, let's stay with this for a second. And such a person, okay, so Rambam describes this as the quality of the Levium. Rambam describes this as the quality of the Levium, that they were so dedicated to their avoda of Hashem, and so zealous in it, that God had guaranteed that they would be provided for, right? And in fact, he had created a system to do that, right? And Rambam goes on to say that such individuals who have this quality are like Levium, that they will be cared for and taken care of as well, right? And this person need not worry about material matters at all. Most people are not on this exalted level, and they're tested by having to work for their attainments, while still realizing that they are not the ultimate determinants of their success, prosperity, or accomplishments. Many designs are in man's heart, but the counsel of God, only it will prevail. That's from Mishlei. The concept of bitachon, so essential for Jewish life at all times, required special enunciation when the conquest of the land of Israel began. This is why Jericho was conquered miraculously, but with the passive involvement of the soldiers who merely circled the city without their traditional weapons. The army of Israel particularly needed to be reminded of its basic truth of Jewish history. The Jewish people do not conquer the land of Israel, nor retain the land of Israel through force of arms and superiority of our soldiers. Some with chariots from Tehillim and hang on a second. So in describing Israel, it says, David Melech says, this is from Tehillim 20. Now I know that the Lord has delivered his anointed one, answering him from his holy heavens with the mighty saving power of his right hand. Some rely on chariots and some upon horses, but we rely upon and invoke the name of the Lord our God. They bend and fall, but we rise and stand firm. God deliver us, may the King answer us on the day we call. So this is the thought here. The irony of the modern Jewish life in Israel is that when the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, were perceived as outmanned, outgunned, and underdogs, and the weaker party, for instance, in the War of Independence, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the IDF was successful and victorious, not to mention Israel was slightly more popular internationally. In recent years, as Israel is perceived as a superior military force, the most powerful army in the Middle East, it cannot vanquish its foes, is weaker and more vulnerable than before, and has gradually lost its will to fight and defend the homeland. That is because the land of Israel is neither conquered nor retained through physical might alone. It's a very interesting observation, right? Is that, when it seemed like we were fighting for our very existence, and we had soldiers who were barely, they really were untrained, especially in the War of Independence, right? And, we were creating our own mortars, and everything was, the legends of the early days are very strong, but we were viewed as conquerable, and we were not conquerable. Now, it turns out that we do battle with forces that seem apparently much weaker than ourselves, and we can't deter them. We're unsuccessful at deterring them, and we see the kind of threats that come about because of a lack of deterrence that we have today.
David, when we send leaflets to tell people to leave right before we start bombing them, it would be... it's not... I think it's because Jews continue to treat themselves differently, like the world treating us differently.
I think that the will to fight and a sense of humanity are not two separate things. What you're saying is that the Jewish sense of humanity has caused us to be weak as fighters. And I don't think that's true. I think there's other things that have caused us to be weak as fighters. And if you look at our history, even during the earlier wars that we had, Jews were very humanitarian in terms of how they took care of their enemies. They had a remarkable record in terms of it. And the very few situations where it seems that it got out of hand, has been blown way out of proportion. Way out of proportion, right? So I don't think that our humanity is necessarily what weakens us, right? There are other things, right? One of them is a very big question.
I think it's a political.
It's all political.
That's right. And that politics may come from the question, should we possess the land? How many times have we heard this statement that somebody should get up in the UN and say the reason why Israel has the land of Israel, the Jews have the land of Israel, is because God determined it was theirs. End of sit down, end of conversation, right? And believe it, right? We have a lot of trouble with that. We have a lot of discomfort with that. And we're always looking for ways, to satisfy an enemy, because somewhere deep down inside, we may not think that this really is ours. And that's a serious problem. Just ignore that. It's just an alarm going off. It's not something we have to worry about. Okay. So,
it's not a weakness, but if it would not be political, Syria would not exist.
In recent years, though, as Israel is perceived as superior military force and most powerful army in the Middle East, it cannot vanquish its foes, is weaker and more vulnerable than before, and has gradually lost the will to fight and defend its homeland. That is because the land of Israel is neither conquered nor retained through physical might alone. When we're relying on just strictly hardware, instead of a dream, by the time you get to it, it will end. Right? If we decide that we're going to rely on our defenses strictly through technology and hardware, and forget that Israel, I can remember it because I was born roughly the same year that Israel was created, that Israel in its early days was a dream for all democratic nations, not just for the Jews. It was really a light unto the nations. It was suddenly reborn from the ashes, right? This place, right? That kind of rhetoric today has a feeling of being melodramatic, has a feeling of demagoguery, but it isn't. It is exactly what we should be, right? We should be at that level, right? And if we were at that level, then these issues would not exist, in fact. But we're uncomfortable with it. We want to, we don't want to talk about the principles on which we're founded, the nobility of our history, who we are, why we're back, right? This is the lesson.
What do you mean we don't want to...
Our politicians, right? When you read the speeches of Menachem Begin, right? You read the speeches that came before, of David Ben-Gurion, right?
Right.
These, by the way, were not religious people.
No.
It's a very interesting thing. But they were visionaries.
Begin was religious.
But Begin was. But they were visionaries.
He was fighting for Shabbos and Knesset.
Right. I agree. But they were visionaries. And they understood what this land should be, right?
Exactly.
And what we call not religious, right? I would argue that almost all of them were, right? This very famous story about, David Ben-Gurion making his case, right? Or maybe Chaim Weizmann, but I think it was David Ben-Gurion. And when he was speaking with the U.S. ambassador, he said, as I understand it, it was roughly some 200 years ago, or no, it's 300 years ago, that the pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. What?
Ben-Gurion.
Ben-Gurion.
With the boat?
Yeah. He said, that was a legendary story of the Mayflower arriving, in what became America, right? Who was the captain of the ship? What did they eat? What was the name of their leaders? Their families? What date did they leave from England? On what date did they arrive? Plymouth Rock. He said, if you ask, do we belong in this land? We were exiled. And we came back. And I can tell you the day and the hour that we left Egypt. I can tell you the name of the leaders and the name of the leaders of the tribes. I can tell you what they ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Right? Our history. which is far older, is far more vivid and far more connected to this land than you are to the Mayflower. That was his point.
Right.
We should never forget that it doesn't have to do with technology. Technology should be an outcome, a tool, just as the shofars were a tool, just as the Aron was a tool, right? They represent God's will that this tiny nation, the size of New Jersey, it's bizarre. It's the greatest army in the Middle East. It's certainly the smallest army in the Middle East. You know, what is it? What are they talking about here? This is a will of God. We should recognize it. And if we could recognize it, then our attitudes towards the land would change dramatically. But if we think we're protected by computer chips, right, we're off base. The computer chips are the will of God. This was a lesson taught on this is the lesson that was taught by the assault on Jericho and the invasion of the land of Israel generally. The people were promised that if they were worthy, they would defeat the kings of Canaan and capture the land without even one casualty, an impossibility in warfare. Hence the mortification and the admission of sin when 36 Jewish soldiers were killed in the Battle of Ai, which came later. Right? Suddenly something, we're going to come to it later. Suddenly soldiers were dying in the field. What caused it? Right? We'll come to it later. Jericho established the base, and by the way, this now comes back, this whole idea comes back to the initial story that we read with Rechav and the spies, right? Okay, with Rechav and the spies, right? Why? Because this is what Joshua wanted to know. Are we deserving of this kind of help from God, of this victory? And when he realized that they were, after the encounter with Rechav, he understood that this is the process that would go on. Jericho established the basic principle of conquest, and even our elementary military maneuvers were pointless. After Jericho, our efforts are required, but we do not rely on or expect our own power to provide either partial or total victory. Our efforts reflect our desire not to depend on miracles, but to accept humbly the providential nature of providential nature of our existence. That we are a nation unique and dependent on God's providence for our success. We never believe for a moment that our success or failure hinges on anything but our spiritual standing before God and His will. That is why it was crucial to preserve the memory of this miracle in a number of ways, especially, as Yaakov Shimoni cited above notes, through the Hakafas of Sukkot and Hoshana Rabbah. Right, so next year, right, when it's time to, do Hakafas and to think about this, right, we should think about what this is. I always thought it was about a victory in court. It's actually a very clear, victory. It's the conquest of Jericho. They were intended to remember, and we're intended to remember that the weapons we had were entirely spiritual at the time.
And it's so much appropriate for Sukkot because we are standing in the hats, in the sukkah, which is a part of being in the
where they left from.
War.
Rav Yitzchak Ibn Gias, based on the Yerushalmi, explained that we commemorate the conquest of Jericho on Hoshana Rabbah. Sukkot itself is a celebration of the land of Israel and the miracles that occurred there. The first miracle in the land itself, and the miracle that created the framework of our possession of the land, was the capture of Jericho. The Rambam adds that this is why Yehoshua decreed that Jericho never be rebuilt, so that it should remain as an eternal wonder and a spectacle to onlookers. He says in the Guide to the Perplexed, in the third section, the Nevuchim, therefore, and he's talking about generally things that are left standing. Right? Therefore, all these fancies are rebutted, and the traditional relations of all these miracles is confirmed through enumeration of those stations. So the men who come could see them, and thus know how great was the miracle constituted by the sojourn of the human species in those places for 40 years. He's talking about the list of places where the Jews stayed. For the same reason, Joshua cursed him who would ever build up Jericho, so that this miracle should subsist permanently. For whoever would see the wall sunk in the ground, says Rambam, would clearly understand that such cannot be the aspect of a demolished building, but that this building sank through a miracle. Right? When you saw Jericho, you would say, this wasn't, as the song says, the walls tumbling down. This was, they just sank into the ground. This was clearly a miracle. And this was the reason why Joshua cursed those who would rebuild it. Because he wanted those walls to always be there. Even, if you were going to build another city, call it something else, nearby to block the path, okay. But don't mess with these walls. That's what Joshua was saying. Right? And we did.
He added something to the wall when he rebuilt, or built something on the top of the wall?
I think but apparently the walls have been found again.
And you can see it probably now, you can see with the...
I don't really know the details of it. Check with Simcha.
Yeah, I should question.
Indeed, Chazal aver that the walls of Jericho did not come tumbling down, but rather were absorbed into the ground. Since their thickness and height were identical, it had to sink into the ground. Or, as Rashi adds, the walls' collapse would not have been noticeable. Sunken walls covered by layers of subsequent civilizations still remain, an eloquent testimony to the miracle and the supremacy of God's will.
Covered with what?
Covered with layers of subsequent civilizations.
People build them too.
Right. Yeah, Tzfat. Rav Dessler further elucidates that the great cry of the people that Yeshua describes demonstrated to them the futility of human endeavors in comparison to God's will. If God will not guard a city, this is from Tehillim, the watchman is what is the value of the watchman's vigilance? This is it's from 127. If the Lord does not build a house, then its builders labor upon it in vain. If the Lord will not guard a city, vigilance of its watchmen is in vain. It is in vain for you who rise early and sit up late, and who eat the bread of tension, for in fact he gives his loved ones sleep. I didn't have to read that.
Thank you.
Sometimes there's a concern that people don't sleep in it. Nor should one be concerned, as the Rabbi feared, that this miracle left skeptics with the possible natural explanation for advance, that excessive noise brought the walls down. Skeptics will try to dismiss every miracle as naturalistic, a coincidence, or predictable, and this option is allowed them in order to maintain their right of free choice. Even miracles test our faith that God's hand does not control all. So we know this is always true with all miracles, is that they're, we've talked about the Sea of Reeds, that the wind blew all night, that it was a shallow sea, that it had high tides, that it was a full moon, and consequently it split. If we didn't have those as options, then it would remove free choice from everybody. Because the ultimate free choice is not between vanilla and chocolate. The ultimate free choice is, does God exist? Right? And a God who creates that choice is a very great God. But he says, this will be your choice, not mine. I can prove to you, beyond a shadow of doubt, who I am, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to prove to you within a shadow of a doubt, so that you come to the conclusions you have. This is actually the will of God. If you think about it, you could create, I could create robots to sit around this table here, right? And at the end of the shiur, they would all stand up and applaud, right? Like so, right? So, like an Woody Allen movie, all the robots. Right. So, and I could do that, right? How rewarding would that be for me? Not very rewarding. How rewarding is it when you're learning with students and other people, and at the end of it they say, gee, this was a valuable experience. It's tremendously rewarding because they might have said, I don't think I want to continue this process. It's a waste of my time, right? So God created man with exactly that choice, not to be a robot. Right? And that's what's required every time we look at a miracle and we say, well, there's a natural explanation for it. But God has a secret to the natural explanations for it. And it's not a secret of the miracle itself. It's a secret of the calendar. And that is, when does the miracle happen? Right? That is to say, maybe the Sea of Reeds splits, once a month. Maybe it splits, every 10 years. Right? Maybe this wasn't the only time it ever split. But it split at a time that Moses needed it to split.
Right.
Timing.
And it closed at a time when Moses needed it to close.
Right.
That's a miracle.
Yeah, because now they're trying to explain this like
otherwise what you end up doing is saying that that Moses is a very good weatherman. Really, that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And we know he's not that good, right? So it wasn't actually the miracles themselves that maybe have been so remarkable, but certainly the timing makes it beyond a question, right? And this is true. This is true consistently, right? Yeah, that maybe the walls of Jericho would have fallen down with a thunderstorm and enough noise, but they fell down when the Jews blew the shofar and they shouted,
right?
And it terrified the people, and they lost the war. They were in tremendous fear at that moment.
And thunderstorm takes stones all over the place.
What?
Yeah,
it's like a curtain came down.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But it was an impregnable curtain. It was one that could not be breached. And not one stone had been moved. There were no battering rams. There were no war towers, right?
But it's actually, if Joshua wanted it to stay like this as a monument to, it will remove the free will. If somebody look at it and, I didn't see it, but if I would look at something like this, it would make it very...
No, I don't think so.
Story of Haggadah, we actually don't have any proofs.
What?
In story of Haggadah, of Makkahs, we don't have a proofs. We don't have a frogs, skeletons, in tremendous amount all over the...
This is another discussion I don't want to go into, but you know that archaeologists hold that the Jews were never in Egypt. Many archaeologists, that they were a Canaanite tribe that gave up, human slaughter, and took another route at some point, right? But they're no different than everybody else, right? It's such foolishness, right? Because then, what are we doing here now? If we're just, where are those other 7 tribes, right? What happened to them all, right? Where is their nationalities? Oh, I understand this because we were a mighty military force for the last 2,500 years. Last 3,500 years. No, we were nothing. Right? We're here as a freak of history. That's why we're an anomaly of history. That's what historians say, right? What's the explanation? There is none. There is no explanation, right? The explanation at the end is the will of God. It's the only explanation.
Yeah. By everything what you're saying, just one phrase, when all those 10 punishments and everything, and the last one when he said now you will see that God is fighting for you, and this is what it is.
Actually, it was on the 7th.
What? Or maybe on the 7th. I don't remember which mark how it was. But he says, now you will see that God is fighting for you. And that's exactly it.
No, because the lessons of the Makos, and it's a very important thing to understand, the lessons of the plagues were for the Egyptians, they were for the world, and in the end, the lessons of the plagues were for the Jewish people themselves. The settlement of the land of Israel is dependent on the renunciation of the illusion that my strength and the might of my hand produced me all this wealth. That's a quote from Devarim, that God says, you will come to say that, and that's not a good thing. This attitude is the kernel of the heresy and the disbelief, and the rejection of this idea is a guarantee of our permanent residence in the land, if we understand that. Thus, once Jericho was conquered, immediately the entire land could be conquered. I.e., once we established and embraced the principle that warriors do not overpower the nations of Canaan, but the will of God does, then the entire land of Israel would be easily subjugated. Jericho was the Nagra, the deadbolt, on the land of Israel, not because the city itself, but because of the nature of the conquest and what it symbolized. And God was with Yeshua, and his renown spread throughout the land. The 31 kings, here it is. The 31 kings of Canaan began to flee in panic. They could not resist this most unconventional adversary. This is also why we are obligated to recite the blessing of thanksgiving when we view the walls of Jericho. In fact, Chazal state that Yehoshua composed Olenu. We say it at the end of all davening. The famous prayer of gratitude that concludes each of our prayer services during the 7 days of the circling of Jericho. To thank Hashem is to recognize his hand in all our affairs and to sublimate our will to his will. Our rights to the land of Israel are reinforced by this acknowledgement and undermined by its repudiation. How were all the sounds from the base of Mikdash, the gates opening, the song of Leviim, the call of the shofar, heard in Jericho? Chazal perceived Jericho's status as analogous to that of Yerushalayim, because it was the very beginning of the conquest of the land of Israel. In a sense, Yerushalayim is kind of the conclusion of it. Right? Now I build the house of God.
That's right. And the beginning was the Jericho.
Jericho was the first place where the holy people encountered the Holy Land, where the sanctity of the Jewish people became linked to the sanctity of the land of the Jews. The holiest place in Israel is the Holy of Holies in Yerushalayim, but Jericho was a place where the people, who are the natural possessors of the land of Israel, first enjoyed the holiness of the land of Israel. So Jericho was always echoed the sounds of Yerushalayim. There in Jericho, we first experienced the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, the sanctity of the land, and would only culminate with the conquest of Yerushalayim during David's time. I'll just read one more paragraph and we'll hold here. The miraculous crossing of the Jordan enunciated the idea that all of nature is in God's hands, but the idea blossomed and achieved fruition at the first act of conquest in Jericho. The soldiers were placed front and center to impress upon them and the nation, and that the soldiers do not win the battle of wars. Remember, they were placed front and center, but without weapons. Right?
But we still need them. They need...
Yes. A different force, the hand of Hashem, fights for the Jewish people. Right? The next section is called Return to Nature. Very politically correct phrase.
But why do you need the soldiers? Why you don't have a Kohanim walking around, little children running with the flowers, whatever? Why do you need soldiers?
So we saw that why do you need to get up in the morning and go to your job? Right.
Yeah, but somebody has to kill all these people.
Yeah. There was armies inside of Jericho.
Somebody with a weapon.
And the destruction of those armies, right, was really...
Not everyone can take a sword and just...
No, you have to annihilate
smash the kids. You need special training for this.
But also, one of the factors here, and it's a very important factor, is that a decision was made that it's a partnership, right? Because your question could have a different answer, right? You remember the story, I'm trying to remember which Haftorah it is, it involves Elisha, right? That the two lepers go to the camps that's been vanquished, right? Right? And we saw it even on our own, in our own time. The battle, the first Iraq war that the U.S. fought. There was this highway that I still remember the pictures of it, which was just strewn with military vehicles, and the Iraqi army were grabbing civilian vehicles to get out because they didn't, and throwing their uniforms away as they left. So you ask a good question. There could have been a plague inside the city the night before the walls came down, and there would be no need for soldiers at all. Right? But clearly God felt that this is a combination of our efforts, Hishtadalus, and the divine hand. Right? We were facing something that we could not possibly conquer. Right? This was walls that could not be breached. Everybody understood it. The people on either side of the wall understood it. Right? The Jews believed that God would tear these walls down for them. and they proceeded to follow his plan of action. Right? But his plan of action involved that they had to conquer the city once the walls were down. It was not a free ride. You know the story about the guy who wants to win the lottery. He complains to God over and over and over, God, I'm a good Jew, let me win the lottery. And then one day from behind the Aron Kodesh, he hears the voice of God saying, Shmuel,
buy a ticket.
Meet me halfway. At least buy a lottery ticket.
Right.
So in this situation, right, that God said, I will destroy the barrier, but you will have to win the war. And you will win it without losing any soldiers. Right, as well.
That effort has to be made.
So we learn from this, many things, right? We learn that there's a partnership with God, that in the land of Israel that partnership is very obvious. And we learn the importance of Jericho, which we don't have today, and we learn the importance of the partnership with God and the Israeli Defense Forces, that they work together. We should never forget it.